Chapter 14. The Age of the Entrepreneur. Introduction. In this lecture, you learn how the country took its first big steps into modernity, bounding with zeal and ambition towards the promise of prosperity. It was an opportunity largely for individuals, for the most ambitious and daring members of the polyglot American family. Still, the age of the robber barons was yet to come. At this time, the age of the entrepreneur glowed with promise. The wide-open spaces of the untamed West beckoned. The tools of the Industrial Revolution were daily arriving from Europe and being forged in the humble shops of hopeful American artisans. The immigrant tide was beginning to really surge, bringing multitudes of eager, hungry workers, among them the clever and industrious Germans, and even down south, in the sleepy climes of the slave and his aristocratic master, inventor Eli Whitney had invented a machine that would within a few decades transform this backward region into what became known as the Cotton Kingdom, and make Southern planters wealthy beyond the dreams of avarice. Up north, water-driven mills began to thrust their churning paddles into any fast stream that could be built on, to grind the grain and run the machinery of the emerging industrial economy that everybody saw coming on the horizon and arriving in some form or other almost every day. The age of steam huffed and puffed its way off the drawing boards of invention into the shops and the forges of crude but functional manufacturing plants. Mass production was invented. The canal boat was replaced by the steam train, almost before the canal could be overgrown with the weeds that nodded agreement in the noonday sun with the fact of its self-made obsolescence. So quickly did the technology of the steam train overtake it. Robert Fulton cobbled together a belching primitive steamboat which changed every navigable river in the country from a one-way street to a two-way highway. Elias Howe and Isaac Singer invented a machine that could turn cloth into ready-made clothing, almost without human hands ever touching the cloth. Samuel Morse invented Morse code, and then built an electronic device to send messages over a wire anywhere in the country at the speed of light. It was as magical and as powerful a communication tool in his day as email was to become in ours. The U.S. Patent Office became so inundated with inventions that the bureaucrat running the place announced one day that it wasn't possible that anything more could be invented, and resigned because his services were, he said, no longer needed. And that was before Henry Ford invented the modern automobile, and the Wright brothers invented the airplane, before the Internet and the computer had even been thought of, before the jet age, the space age, and the atomic age. Since, in a global sense, all of this invention was done primarily by Americans, especially in the engineering aspect of making it practical and affordable so that everybody could use it, you can see that this first era of American invention, the subject of this lecture, was the start of something really big. That's why we say that this lecture is uniquely about the country taking its first big steps into modernity. The story is about much more than technology, however. In fact, the technology part is, in the end, only a chapter in the larger human story about how it changed the way Americans thought of themselves and related to each other. This technology revolution changed a lot more than technology. It changed how business was done, for example. It changed American religion by raising that old bugaboo about the conflict between science and religion, which had to be argued about all over again. It changed the American workplace from a shop where the employees thought of themselves and the boss as a kind of extended family to a factory where nobody knew anybody, and the boss, along with the faceless corporate company he answered to, were adversaries for the worker. It changed the economy from one which offered a modicum of opportunity for most people into one which was divided into the haves, who seemed to have everything money could buy and still had money left over, and the have-nots, who had nothing that money could buy and no way of getting any. It even began changing the family farm from a revered fountain of American values which somehow created character by making a farm kid milk a cow every morning at 5 a.m. instead of letting him sleep in, into just another form of mass production called agribusiness, mega-farms run by businessmen for whom the values of agrarian America were irrelevant. We think of this particular change as thoroughly modern, accomplished mostly in the last half of the 20th century. But the change actually began 100 years before that, in the country's first era of industrialization, which we are considering now. Other notable changes of this era, which had big effects later, were the changes in public education, the roles of women in society, and the compartmentalization of the economy. These were the years in which school attendance began to be required, mandated now for every child by law. An industrial-based commercial economy needed literate workers. At the same time, classical education in literature, the arts, and the sciences, teaching young people how to be discerning, teaching them about history, and how to write and speak well, teaching them civics and the duties of responsible citizenship, began to fade, replaced by an emphasis on mastering technology rather than on understanding humanity. As for women, progress for them as a group was offered on the factory floor. Now they had permission to trade the drudgery of the kitchen for the drudgery of tending a noisy, clanking, dangerous machine. You could bring your 10-year-old daughter to work, too. In fact, if you were a woman in the factory, your wages were so low you had to bring your daughter to work so the family could eat that night. She got to learn to do the same mindless, repetitive job you were doing. What an exciting prospect for little Jenny, and what an inspiring role model Mom got to be. And finally, the early age of industrialization began to compartmentalize the economy into a symbiotic system of mutual dependency. The South produced cotton to feed the industrial looms of the North, and rice to feed the Northern workers. The North produced clothing from the cotton to clothe the workers of the South, and manufactured goods to run their farms. Both North and South produced food and manufactured goods for the Westerners, who themselves grew grains, corn, and livestock to enliven and nourish the diets of the Northerners and the Southerners, in addition to their own. The Westerners also mined the metals, the gold and silver from which to make the country's money, and the copper, zinc, and iron to make the country's telegraph wires, steel rails, locomotives, iron-hulled ships, firearms, plows and farming implements, steamboats, and industrial plants. Later, the Westerners, along with the Pennsylvanians and the Texans, would drill for the oil, too, when they found it at last, to power the age of the internal combustion engine, which followed the age of steam. As the economy became compartmentalized, the bankers, whose investments funded all of this industrial growth, made sure the economy stayed that way. That made monopoly control easier, which minimized risk and increased profits. The whole story of the country's multifaceted first leap into modernity is here for you in this lecture, and we haven't even gotten to the Civil War yet. If you think this story is amazing, wait until you get the real Industrial Revolution in America, which unfolded 50 years later, after the Civil War. This period was just a warm-up for that one, just a rehearsal. But you have to understand this one now, so you can understand that one later. And you have to understand both of them so you can understand how it all evolved into the world you live in today.